Neo-Marxist and gender analysis of the concepts control and ideology in children's fairy tales. Children's minds are as white canvases in the process of growth and formation of human life, and it is a media brush which colors and forms them in the framework of the societal hegemony. The tool which can play the role of conveying the hegemony and controlling the child's thoughts in the body of media is children's literature, in which fairy tales have held their position for a long time. In this article, it has been tried to analyze these popular stories of children's literature by the use of Neo-Marxism theory and the features of gender study theory in order to examine the stereotypes and concepts of control and ideology. For this reason, the two of most popular fairy tales are chosen, the Cinderella and Rapunzel. Also, by comparison between these fairy tales and the animations produced based on them, the way stereotypes and these concepts are presented through animations are analyzed. As Riva Gottfried says in her article Ideology, Myth, and Politics in Children's Literature, children's books are not isolated from the structures of knowledge and the ideas in society. Therefore, they may not escape the bias that might be written between the lines. From the 14th century adventure stories recited in verse of European Romantic descent to folklore kept alive through the oral tradition, storytelling and childhood seem to accompany one another synonymously. However, in the mid to late 18th century, a printed form of literature emerged that we can call children's literature as we know it. Most studies of the history of children's literature start around the middle of the 18th century. The literature which emerged in the 18th century was highly didactic and moralistic. The children's book was seen by many as a place to preach and instruct. In these early children's books, correct moral behavior was rewarded and praised, while defiance and disobedience were brutally punished. The children's literature in the late 18th century is reflective of the pious attitudes favorable to authors and literature patrons. Children's fictions had little development in early 19th century. The evangelical tone and style were ruling in literature until 1840s. The influential change in society was reflected in the literature of the time as secularism and rationalism were becoming dominant values. In this era, religion became a less common element in children's literature. Moral instruction became less explicit by the end of the century, although it was a notable feature of children's books. By the end of the 19th century, a variety of such books were available to boys, but in this period, nothing matching this was produced for girls. Books produced were didactic and domestic in content, and while stories for boys had begun to move away from the explicitly moral, girls' stories remained religious and moral. In the 1860s, a huge growth in the literature written for children was seen according to social and economic changes after efficient printing and a great drop in the cost of books. In the late 19th century, fantasy fiction for children began to be produced with identifiable features. The first golden age of children's literature began in that time. Fantasy literature has had a stronger and longer relationship with both children and morality. Fantasy has its roots in the fairy tale, however, where the fairy tale world assumes magic in the same way a realistic novel assumes its absence, fantasy fiction may incorporate a magical element, but when it does, that element, far from being assumed, is fantastic relative to the realistic aspects of the work. Fantasy literature considers the existence of a supernatural element within the framework of a text to the same degree that realistic fiction has its own facts founded in the material world. In children's literature, good behavior is still uniformly rewarded, while naughty behavior is reprimanded. Children's literature is not always perceived in the same way as other literatures. When it comes to children's literature or media, the first thing thought about is its suitability, content, and ideological stance. Children's literature is a communication from the experienced adult to the inexperienced child. It matters as an important and powerful literature since it has deep influence on society. Neo-Marxism is a loose term for various 20th century approaches which extend Marxism and Marxist theory by incorporating elements from other intellectual traditions, such as critical theory, psychoanalysis, or existentialism. As with many uses of the prefix neo, many theories and groups designated as neo-Marxist have attempted to supplement the perceived deficiencies of orthodox Marxism or dialectical materialism. In a sociological sense, neo-Marxism adds Max Weber's broader understanding of social inequality, such as the status and power, to Marxist philosophy. Neo-Marxism is often used to describe opposition to inequalities experienced by underdeveloped countries in the global world. Like other types of literature, works written especially for children are informed and shaped by the author's respective value systems, their notions of how the world is or ought to be. These values reflecting a set of views and assumptions regarding such things as human nature, social organization and norms of behavior, moral principles, questions of good and evil, right and wrong, and what is important in life constitute their ideologies. Peter Hunt says children's literature is a powerful literature, and such a power cannot be neutral or innocent or trivial. The word ideology was coined by Count D'Estude du Tracy in the late 18th century to define the science of ideas. Language and ideology are intertwined. It has been argued from a number of social and critical perspectives that language as a system of signification, what is commonly referred to as discourse, is endemically and pervasively imbued with ideology. Language embodies ideology, and so a narrative without ideology is unthinkable. Ideology is formulated in and by language. Meanings within language are socially determined, and narratives are constructed out of language. There is no literature which is free of an ideological position in the same way that no people could be described as free of ideology. Ideologies impregnate a society's mode of thinking, speaking, experiencing, and behaving. Ideology does not exist in text as a separate, recognizable entity. As discussed above, ideology is embedded in language, but it also exists on several levels. According to Peter Hollindell, it operates on 3 levels. The first type Hollindell describes as an explicit surface ideology, which is identified easily and the author is aware of its presence. This kind of ideology that is easy to observe in early children's literature, which was very often evangelical and deliberately didactic. The second type of ideology is that which the author is not necessarily aware of. Hollindell calls this passive ideology. This is the most powerful type of ideology. This one may be virtually impossible to observe, especially in contemporary texts where the values expressed by the author are in line with our own. The third type of ideology is called inherent ideology and is that which is inherent within language. It is similar to passive ideology in that it is not a conscious product of the imagination. It is differentiated from passive ideology in that it is found within the codes which constitute the text, rather than the unconscious assumptions of the authors and the reader's values. Whatever all ideologies are, they are primarily some kind of ideas, that is, belief system. Just as there are no private languages, there are no private or personal ideologies. Ideologies are not any kind of socially shared beliefs, such as sociocultural knowledge or social attitudes, but more fundamental or axiomatic. Ideologies are socially prevalent ideas that can be explained by showing how they either sanction the social relations determined by the existing stage of productive powers or express and promote class interest. Ideology is a mediatory concept par excellence, bridging gaps between the individual and the social, between fantasy and cognition, between economics and aesthetics, objectivity and the subject, reason and the unconscious, the private and the public. Ideology is a key term in literary, cultural, and film studies. Today's understanding of the term is rooted in the writings of Marx and Engels. In their original sociological analysis, they define ideology as the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. The class which has the means of material production at its disposal has control at the same time over the means of mental production. Gender studies is a field of interdisciplinary study devoted to gender identity and gendered representation as central categories of analysis. These disciplines study gender and sexuality in the fields of literature, language, geography, history, political science, sociology, anthropology, cinema, and media studies. Gender roles are a perceived set of behavioral norms usually associated with males and females in a given social group or system. They allow individuals to refer to certain attitudes or behaviors that class a person's stereotypical identity. This concrete behavior of individuals is both a socially enforced role and value, as well as being individuals' disposition, genetic, unconscious, or conscious. Gender roles are often conditioned by household structures, access to resources, specific impacts of the economy, and other local relevant factors. When looking at the history of animations, there is a trend in the roles that female characters play within the movies. In analyzing them through a timeline, it is easy to see how these roles progress through time. Gender roles are very prominent in animations. Typically, women are portrayed as a princess, queen, or homemaker. A princess is a female heroine that many children look up to as role models. Though usually not princesses by birth, these women are praised for their determination, skills, and a strong will. In early animations, the princess was shown through a traditional fairy tale. The heroine needs rescuing by the nearby prince, meeting the standard of early 20th century ideals. Cinderella is a great example of this. She is left to stay in the same enforced servitude for the rest of her life until she escapes by marriage. Cinderella and many others were tales that drew on traditional legends. Animations have unquestionably displayed men and women in stereotypical roles and in stereotypical body forms. Some critics would suggest that this is the result of hidden motives, while in reality it is only a side effect of common public norms and the very nature of animation. Animations could be seen as a very sexist influence on children, only starting to form their views of the world. However, when considered with the society that created them, animations fall in line with the sexual biases that exist in society. While most of the young women in animations are happy homemakers, the older women in animations, such as stepmothers, are portrayed as evil characters. Casey Schmidt for the Daily Campus, she looks at how many of these princesses are not only okay with homemaker role, but also the love at first sight role. She argues that before calling these young princesses role models, one should take another look. Cinderella, or the Little Glass Slipper, is a folktale embodying a myth element of unjust oppression. Thousands of variants are known throughout the world. The title character is a young woman living in unfortunate circumstances that are suddenly changed to remarkable fortune. The oldest documented version comes from China, and the oldest European version from Italy. The most popular version was first published by Charles Perrault in 1697, and later by the Brothers Grimm in their folktale collection Grimm's Fairytales. The first written European version of the story was published in Naples, Italy, by Basile in his Pentameron. The story itself was based in the Kingdom of Naples, at that time the most important political and cultural center of southern Italy and among the most influential capitals in Europe. Although the story's title and main character's name change in different languages, in English language folklore, Cinderella is the archetypal name. The word Cinderella has come to mean one whose attributes were unrecognized or one who unexpectedly achieves recognition or success after a period of obscurity and neglect. The still popular story of Cinderella continues to influence popular culture internationally, lending plot elements, allusions, and tropes to a wide variety of media. Rapunzel is a German fairy tale in the collection assembled by the Brothers Grimm, and first published in 1812 as part of Children's and Household Tales. Rapunzel, which is an indirect adaptation of an earlier tale, Purcinella by Basile, in 1634, is about a pregnant woman who sends her husband to a witch's garden to pick up some Rapunzel, since she is craving it. The witch catches the husband stealing from her garden and tells him he can take some, but she gets the baby when it's born. The husband agrees and brings it back to his wife. The baby is born, the witch takes it and raises her and has her hair grow very long. When the girl is old enough, the witch locks her in a tower. The only way to get in is by having the girl, Rapunzel, throw down her hair so that the witch can climb it. One day, a prince comes by and sees a witch climbing the hair into the tower. And after the witch leaves, he calls out. And she lowers her hair, he climbs up. And then they have an epic love story, until the witch finds out. The witch cuts off the girl's hair and sends her into the wild and then ties the hair up and waits for the prince. And when he's climbing up, she drops the hair and the prince. The prince is blinded in the fall and roams around in search of Rapunzel. Eventually, he finds her and she cries into his eyes. The tears cure him of his blindness. They have twins and return to his kingdom to live happily ever after. In both stories, elements of contradiction between bourgeois and proletarian are used. The silence of protagonist, who is a woman in both the stories, is prevalent. In the Cinderella story, the contradiction is between the father, as the internal government, and the stepmother, who stand as the outsiders. After the father's death or the destruction of the internal government, stepmother and her allies, as her daughters, have the worst violence done to Cinderella, or the colonized character. Stepmother in most fairy tales is demonstrated as antagonist, and a jealous character who just thinks about her own benefits. Cinderella bears all hardship, does not complain. She only tries for being a good person. She lives with her dreams and waits for the day that her dreams come true. She has got a passive character who only lives in her dreams. Her passivity in front of the dictatorship of a stepmother, the hardship of her life, her waiting for a miracle to make her dreams come true are the elements which are observed in most of classical fairy tales, from which the most prominent is Cinderella, who sings while doing house chores, "If you keep on dreaming, the dreams you wished for will come true." She, while being treated so cruelly, is very submissive and oppressed in front of her stepmother and her daughters. These features are shown to implicitly encourage children to become oppressed, become silent in front of cruelties, to accept outside dictatorships, and be humble in front of them. These features of inherent ideology never motivate children to try to find a way to save themselves and others from bad situations. Stepmother gives her hard responsibilities and behaves her as a slave. She is misusing her politeness. Cinderella is very content for what she has. She provides her dress for going to the ball with everything she has. The proletarian becomes content by learning how to use what is already remained for them. Not motivating children to try for change and extending their world and waiting for a savior are elements in not only children's literature but in teaching materials provided for them. Accept who you are and know any change needed will happen by itself. Children learn how to see everybody kind, and anybody with bad behavior is going to be as an outsider or rich person most of the time. So if they want to be good and kind, they should stay satisfied with their poverty. The politics in a stepmother's behavior with Cinderella are important too. She does not forbid her from doing anything, but she puts obstacles on her way to destroy her self-confidence and humiliates her. That is the way her passivity grows. While sewing a dress for Cinderella, the female mouse tells some male mice that you have to keep sewing for women and go to harder works by yourself. So they go to watching or doing harder works. Also, in the animation, the job of gathering food is done by male mice. These stereotypes shown in stories or animations define cultural roles for women and men and each one's responsibilities for children and define outside frameworks for different sexes. Frameworks, although relative or flexible, if anyone changes them, he or she is confronted with barriers like tradition. In that property, everything belongs to Cinderella, but since she is colonized under the tyranny of her stepmother, she can own only the remaining of anything in that house. But when those remainings are used perfectly by her, again they are taken away from her by authorities, as if she has no right to own anything completely. They want her to essay at her limitations. She is very submissive. She just cries for a savior who comes surprisingly to show the observing children that by being quiet and submissive, miracle will come to you at last. As fairy godmother said, Cinderella kept trust and waited for her dreams to come true. Those invisible helps and other kinds of creatures were all signs of the miracle which would happen someday to her. At a ball held by the king, she is found marvelously by the prince. They fall in love at first sight. The main role defined for her by the king is to be a mother to his grandchildren. The king wants his son to marry her and have heirs for the kingdom. Cinderella is colonized in the other form, of course better than her previous experience. But here again, her role is predefined by the capitalist wish to be a mother and homemaker. The media define and builds the role of love, girl, and mother for the kids. Media put these predefined ideas into the unconscious of the children. Rapunzel's story has got great contradictions with its written story and the various animations made based on its plot. These contradictions are due to the fact that these animations are made in recent decades and based on the mental changes of the role of protagonist. But again, this fact does not mean that this work has been kept safe from the effects of capitalism and cultural disadvantages. In the written story, Rapunzel is the daughter of a middle-class family who is taken away by a witch and is saved by a prince at the end. The classical features of contradiction between the bourgeois and proletarians are observed in the classical plot of the story. A poor and weak girl who meets a Prince Charming by chance. Even in some versions of the story, the girl becomes pregnant, and that is the reason of their relationship being revealed to the witch. That is a way to define the role of the woman as a weak person who can only accept whatever destiny brings to her. In one version of the animation made based on this story in 2010, named Tangled, there are many deconstructions made in the story. Here Rapunzel is a princess who is kidnapped from her parents by a witch named Mother Gothel, who can only keep herself young by the power of the magic in Rapunzel's hair. Of course, here again, the concepts of king and princess are prevalent, and also people who love them and are obedient to their king. But in contradiction, there is a witch who betrays the king. What is highlighted in the story is that here the savior is not a Prince Charming, but a burglar who is followed by the soldiers. However, the contemporary animation is not powerful enough to deconstruct the story completely. It cannot ignore the role of the man as a savior and demonstrate the whole power of a woman. Rapunzel tries as a modern protagonist to show her abilities and talents. Hitting a burglar by a pan is what she does to prove her power and stability to the witch. But her ultimate effort is summarized in an absurd fight by a pan. She also tries to manage the situation by her kindness instead of fighting in many situations. Eventually, a man is needed to fight next to her and save her, since her power seems not enough. Although her hair is powerful, but this power comes from a magic outside, not from her nature. When Rapunzel finds out about the truth of her identity, tells it simply to the witch, and the witch imprisons her and beguiles the burglar by her hair and hurts him. Rapunzel chooses to sacrifice her freedom to save him. The woman is the person who even sacrifices her life and freedom to save her lover. At the end, this is Eugene, the burglar lover of her, who saves her by cutting off her hair and the destruction of the witch at the result. Rapunzel had never thought about doing so to get free of the confinement forced on her by her own hair. Both stories are considered as examples of popular fairy tales. Both stories included the elements of capitalism, proletarians, and submission of them. Another kind of this binary is seen in the relationship between the stepmother and Cinderella, and also between the witch and Rapunzel. The former includes elements such as passivity, acceptance, and submission. The latter contain elements like perseverance, timidity, and unsuccessful fights. In both cases, protagonists are waiting for a miracle or a savior. In the first case, the classic structure has a prince who intrudes by his position, but in a more modern case, a burglar comes into the plot and saves the prince. Although in the second example, it is a burglar who marries the princess and his position is changed. In both examples, we are confronted with a man who saves a woman. Consequentially, these stories, which are at the top of their genre in both literature and media, are used perfectly and by any means of commercial aesthetics to convey the ideological elements of submission, capitalism, and gender discrimination to control the minds of each generation implicitly for the benefit of other structures of society. These stories are so influential that have made the definitions of girls and boys for their gender roles. From the ways of clothing and behavior to the definitions of love in their unconscious are affected by the images they see and the stories they hear from their childhood. Media and literature are the best means to convey ideological messages. Besides any kind of deconstruction, traditional elements of superiority are remained till the time that capitalism ruled. The only way to confront it is to redefine these elements by conscious analysis.